July 12th, 1944, 900 hours. 1st U.S. Army Headquarters, Normandy, France. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley sat across from a panel of ordnance officers, his jaw clenched as he read the test results. The morning sun filtered through the canvas tent, illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like frozen shrapnel. Outside, the muffled rumble of distant artillery reminded everyone that men were dying while they argued about penetration values and metallurgy. The numbers on the page told a story Bradley already knew from the casualty reports that crossed his desk each morning. Not one American weapon, not the 75mm Sherman gun, not the 3-inch gun on the M10 tank destroyer, not even the towed anti-tank guns could reliably defeat the German Panther tank from the front. The board's conclusion was stark. Only a shot to the Panther's gun mantlet at 200 yards might work. Maybe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 2 weeks earlier, Bradley's tankers had been confident. The 75mm gun on the M4 Sherman had handled everything the Germans threw at them in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Panzer Mark IIIs and Mark IVs died when American tanks hit them. Even the fearsome Tiger tanks, while dangerous, appeared in small enough numbers that tank destroyers and artillery could handle them. But Normandy was different. The Panthers were everywhere. German tank doctrine had changed. What American intelligence had dismissed as a specialized heavy tank deployed in limited numbers turned out to be Germany's standard medium tank for 1944. Entire Panzer divisions were equipped with them, and American tank crews were dying because they couldn't kill what they couldn't penetrate. The psychological impact was devastating. Sherman crews who had fought confidently in Italy now approached every engagement with dread. They knew the mathematics of survival. A Panther could kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters. A Sherman with a 75mm gun had to close to within 300 meters to have any chance of a side or rear shot. Those extra 1,700 meters represented the distance between life and death, and American tankers were covering that ground with their blood. Sergeant James Rothschadel, a tank commander in the 2nd Armored Division, later wrote about an engagement near St. Lo, where his platoon of 5 Shermans encountered 2 Panthers hull down behind a hedgerow. The German tanks opened fire at 1,500 meters. Within 90 seconds, 4 American tanks were burning. Rothschadel's was the only Sherman that survived, and only because the Germans shifted fire to more threatening targets. He never forgot watching his friends burn alive in machines that couldn't fight back. The crisis had been building since D-Day. On June 6th, not a single American tank that landed on the Normandy beaches carried anything heavier than a 75mm gun. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate decision based on doctrine and logistics. Army ground forces, led by Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, believed tanks should support infantry, while dedicated tank destroyers handled enemy armor. The 75mm gun fired excellent high-explosive shells for supporting infantry. Its armor-piercing capabilities were adequate against most German tanks. Why complicate logistics and training by introducing a new gun? Senior commanders had repeatedly refused offers to equip their divisions, with 76mm Shermans sitting idle in England. The logistical headache of supplying 2 different types of ammunition outweighed any perceived benefit. But the Germans hadn't read American doctrine. Panther tanks appeared in the Bocage country south of the invasion beaches, and American tank crews discovered that their comfortable assumptions were killing them. The Panther's 80mm frontal armor, sloped at 55 degrees, gave it an effective thickness of 140mm. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun firing standard armor-piercing shells could penetrate approximately 88mm at point-blank range and 73mm at 1,000 meters. The math was simple and brutal. From the front, at any practical combat range, the Panther was immune to the Sherman's gun. Meanwhile, the Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor from well over 1,000 meters. American tankers learned to survive through maneuver, coordination, and sacrifice. Standard tactics called for one section of a tank platoon to draw German fire, while another section maneuvered to attack from the flank or rear. The Panther's side armor measured only 40 millimeters, well within the trait, Sherman's capabilities. But these tactics required someone to be the bait. Crews volunteered, knowing they might die to give their friends a chance. The psychological toll was immense. Tank commanders developed a 1,000-yard stare that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with watching their friends die in machines that should have protected them. By early July, the complaints had reached General Dwight Eisenhower himself. On July 2nd, Eisenhower relayed urgent messages from First Army to the Ordnance Department. American tankers were being slaughtered. They needed better guns. They needed them now. The response was the board meeting Bradley attended on July 12th. Ordnance officers brought captured Panther tanks to a testing ground near Iceni. They fired American weapons at the Panther's armor from various ranges and angles. The results shocked everyone except the tankers who had been reporting this for weeks. The 75mm Sherman gun, nothing. Rounds bounced off or penetrated only a few millimeters before shattering. The 3-inch gun on the M10 tank destroyer, marginally better, but reliable penetration required hitting the gun mantlet from 200 yards. The towed anti-tank guns, similarly inadequate. Only the British 17-pounder gun, mounted in Sherman Fireflies, could reliably defeat Panther frontal armor. And the Americans had virtually none of those. Bradley left the meeting and made a decision that would save thousands of lives, though it came too late for many. 130 M4 a 176 W. Shermans had been sitting unused in depots across southern England since April. These tanks mounted the 76mm Moan gun in a larger 23 turret. The gun had been developed specifically to defeat German heavy armor. American division commanders had refused them before D-Day, citing logistics and the reduced high-explosive performance compared to the 75mm. Now Bradley ordered every available 76mm Sherman rushed to France for Operation Cobra, the planned breakthrough offensive scheduled to begin in less than 2 weeks. The response was unprecedented. Within hours, American ordnance officers in England were organizing the movement of 76mm Shermans from depots to ports. Ships were loaded. Crews were briefed on the new weapon. Ammunition was packaged and shipped. The entire operation had one goal: get these tanks to France and into combat before more American tankers died. By July 24th, 102 M4 A176W tanks had arrived in France. 52 went to the 2nd Armoured Division. 50 went to the 3rd Armoured Division. The rest were distributed among separate tank battalions attached to infantry divisions. The urgency was palpable. These tanks represented not just better firepower, but hope. The 76mm Moan gun was a significant improvement over the 75. It fired a 40-pound armor-piercing round at 2,600 feet per second, compared to the 75mm's 15-pound round at 2,200 feet per second. The increased velocity and mass meant dramatically better penetration. At 1,000 yards, the 76mm could penetrate approximately 109mm of flat armor. More importantly, it could penetrate Panther side armor at virtually any combat range, and had a reasonable chance against Panther frontal turret armor at medium ranges. For the first time since the Panthers appeared, American tankers would have a weapon that could fight back. But there was a problem the ordnance officers hadn't mentioned in the board meeting. The 76mm gun, while much better than the 75, still couldn't reliably defeat the Panther's glacis plate, the sloped frontal hull armor. The 80mm of steel at 55 degrees created an effective thickness that exceeded what the 76mm could penetrate, except at point-blank range. American tankers receiving these new weapons would discover this limitation in combat. The 76mm was better, dramatically better, but it wasn't the answer many had hoped for. It was, however, the only answer available, and it would have to be enough. The crews who climbed into these new Shermans in late July 1944 noticed the differences immediately. The 23 turret was larger, with more headroom and better layout. The 76mm gun dominated the turret interior, its massive breech mechanism taking up significant space. The ammunition racks were redesigned, with wet stowage ammunition surrounded by water-filled jackets placed in the hull floor to reduce the catastrophic fires that had made Shermans infamous as death traps. American tankers called their Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter because they lit up so quickly when hit. The wet stowage dramatically reduced that problem, though few crews knew it yet. The gun itself felt different. The 76mm had more recoil, a louder report, and a muzzle blast that kicked up enormous clouds of dust. Early models lacked muzzle brakes, making them impossible to fire without revealing position. Later models, arriving in September, would have threaded barrels for muzzle brakes that solved this problem. But in July, crews had to work with what they had. Gunners learned to fire and immediately order the driver to move, using the dust cloud as concealment for displacement. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than dying in a tank that couldn't fight back. Training was minimal. Most crews got a few hours of familiarization with the new gun before being ordered into combat. The basic operation was similar enough to the 75mm that experienced crews adapted quickly. Load, traverse, aim, fire, repeat. The differences were in the details: more recoil to compensate for, different ballistic tables for range estimation, fewer rounds carried due to the larger ammunition. But American tankers were pragmatic. They would learn the fine points of the weapon while shooting at Germans. That was how they had learned everything else. German intelligence completely missed the deployment. Wehrmacht signals intelligence monitored American radio traffic, but detected no indication of a new tank variant arriving in theatre. German tank commanders expected to face the same 75mm Shermans they had been destroying for weeks. A few isolated reports mentioned heavier guns, but headquarters dismissed them as misidentifications or crew panic under fire. The idea that Americans could deploy a significantly improved tank in less than 2 weeks seemed impossible. German logistics took months to field new equipment. Surely the Americans, with their longer supply lines across the Atlantic, couldn't move faster than that? This assumption would prove fatal for many German Panzer crews. The comfortable superiority they had enjoyed since early June was about to end. Not completely the 76mm. Sherman was still outgunned by the Panther in a frontal engagement, but the gap had narrowed dramatically. More importantly, the psychological effect on both sides would be profound. American tankers would no longer feel helpless. German tankers would discover that not every Sherman was an easy kill. The psychological warfare of armor had shifted. July 25, 1944, 0 to 500 hours. Assembly area near Saint-Jean-de-Day, France. Staff Sergeant Eugene Jean Studensky of Charlie Company, 66th Armored Regiment, 2nd Armored Division, stood beside his new tank. Painted on the turret in white letters was the name Cobra King, chosen by his crew the previous night. The name seemed appropriate given that their first action would be in Operation Cobra, though Studensky privately thought it might be tempting fate. His crew gunner, Corporal Michael DeRiggi, loader Private James Murphy, driver Private Carl Brunson, and assistant driver Private Thomas Welch were making final checks on the vehicle. They had received their M4A1 76W Sherman just 36 hours earlier. Yesterday had been spent familiarizing themselves with the gun, test firing into an earthen berm while ordnance officers watched and took notes. Today they would find out if the new weapon worked against real targets. The pre-dawn darkness was filled with the rumble of engines. Hundreds of tanks were moving into position for the largest American offensive since D-Day. Operation Cobra aimed to break through German lines west of Saint-Lô, then race south and west to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula. If successful, it would transform the static Battle of the Bocage into a war of movement where American advantages in mobility and logistics could be decisive. If it failed, the Allies might be stuck in Normandy for months, grinding through hedgerows in a World War I-style battle of attrition. Studensky checked his watch. In 2 hours, American heavy bombers would carpet bomb a rectangular area south of the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road. The bombardment would create a corridor through German defences. Studensky's battalion would then advance through that corridor, exploiting any breakthrough. The plan was simple. The execution would be anything but. The crew climbed into their positions. Studensky, in the commander's position in the turret, standing with his head and shoulders out of the hatch. De Righi at the gunner's station, eye pressed to the sight. Murphy ready to load. Brunson behind the controls with Welch operating the bow machine gun. They were as ready as 36 hours of training could make them. The bombers arrived on schedule. From miles away, Studensky watched the sky fill with aircraft. Boeing, B-17s and consolidated B-24s, hundreds of them, flying in perfect formation. Then the bombs began falling. The sound was unlike anything he had experienced. A rolling thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if the ground was tearing apart. Columns of smoke and dust rose thousands of feet into the air. The bombing continued for hours. Wave after wave of aircraft dropped their payloads on a rectangular area 3 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep. Anything in that rectangle would be obliterated: German soldiers, tanks, artillery, bunkers, everything. But some of the bombs fell short. Studensky watched in horror as explosions erupted among American positions. The 30th Infantry Division, positioned closest to the target area, took the worst of it. Men and vehicles vanished in eruptions of earth and fire. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the same officer who had opposed heavy tank development and delayed the 76mm Sherman program for years. He had come to the front as an observer and died instantly when a bomb landed in his foxhole. The irony was not lost on tankers like Studensky, who knew McNair's policies had cost American lives. But there was no time for reflection. The order came to advance. Charlie Company moved forward in column formation, each tank following the one ahead through gaps in the hedgerows. The bocage terrain that had favoured defenders for weeks now worked against the Germans. The massive bombing had destroyed hedgerows, filled in ditches, and cratered roads. Navigation was nearly impossible. Studensky navigated by compass and landmarks that no longer existed. The smell was overwhelming explosives, burning wood, and something else he didn't want to identify. They passed German positions that had simply ceased to exist. Bunkers were obliterated. Artillery pieces were twisted metal. Bodies, or what remained of them, lay scattered across a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon. Then they encountered organized resistance. A German anti-tank gun, somehow surviving the bombing, opened fire from a hedgerow 800 meters away. The first round hit the lead Sherman in Charlie Company, penetrating the frontal armor and killing the driver instantly. The tank slewed sideways, blocking the narrow lane. The anti-tank gun fired again, hitting the second Sherman and setting it ablaze. Studensky's tank was third in the column. He screamed into the radio for his company commander to authorize the use of the new rhino tusks steel prongs welded to the front of some Shermans to break through hedgerows. Instead of being trapped on the road, they could maneuver through the bocage itself. The company scattered, each tank smashing through hedgerows in different directions. Brunson gunned the engine, and Cobra King crashed through a wall of vegetation, emerging into a field filled with wrecked German trucks. The anti-tank gun was somewhere to their left. Studensky spotted movement German infantry, retreating through another hedgerow. He ordered Murphy to load high explosive and told de Righi to track the infantry. The 76mm roared. The explosion was massive, far larger than the 75mm HE rounds they were used to. Despite having less explosive filler than the 75mm, the 76mm shell was still devastatingly effective. The German infantry vanished in a cloud of dirt and shrapnel. Cobra King crashed through another hedgerow and found themselves face to face with German armour, a Panzer Mark IV at 300 meters, its turret traversing toward them. Studensky didn't think. He simply screamed, "Panzer! Driver halt! Gunner, traverse right! Fire when ready!" The training took over. De Righi rotated the turret, the electric traverse system humming. Murphy had already loaded an armour-piercing round. The Panzer Mark IV fired first. The German 75mm round hit Cobra King's frontal glacis with a sound like a giant bell, the impact rocking the entire 30-ton vehicle, but the armour held. The round had struck at an angle and ricocheted off into the sky. De Riggy's shot was perfect. The 76mm armor-piercing round crossed the distance in a fraction of a second and punched through the Panzer IV's turret front. The German tank erupted in flames. Studenski stared, hardly believing it. They had just killed a German tank from the front, at range, on their first shot. With the 75mm gun, they would have needed to maneuver for a side shot. The 76mm had saved their lives. The crew sat in stunned silence for perhaps 10 seconds. Then Welch, the assistant driver, began laughing hysterically. Murphy joined in. Even de Riggy, normally stone-faced at his gun sight, was grinning. They had fought back. They had won. For the first time in weeks, American tankers weren't prey, they were predators. The battle continued throughout the day. Charlie Company encountered more German armor, several more Panzer Mark IVs, and ominously, 2 Panthers. The Panthers were hull down behind earthen berms, only their turrets visible. Studenski's company commander, Captain Richard Benson, ordered the 76mm Shermans to provide covering fire, while 75mm Shermans maneuvered for flank shots. It was the same old tactic, but now the covering fire actually threatened the Panthers. The 76mm rounds slamming into Panther turret fronts didn't always penetrate, but they created spectacular showers of sparks and spalling that forced German crews to button up and disrupted their fire control. One Panther tried to reverse to a better position. De Riggy fired at the exposed belly armor as it backed over a rise. The round penetrated and the Panther exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a fireball that sent the turret spinning 50 meters through the air. As darkness fell on July 25th, Charlie Company consolidated in captured German positions south of the bombing zone. They had advanced nearly 10 kilometers, an achievement that would have been impossible a month earlier. More importantly, they had destroyed 8 German tanks and countless other vehicles. Charlie Company had lost 3 Shermans, but all 3 were 75mm models. Every 76mm Sherman had survived. The crews gathered around Cobra King, comparing notes and experiences. Every crew with a 76mm had similar stories. The new gun worked. It wasn't perfect, everyone agreed. The Panther's frontal glacis was still nearly immune, but it was infinitely better than what they'd had before. Word spread through 2nd Armored Division like wildfire. The 76mm Shermans could kill Panthers, maybe not from the front, but they could hurt them, force them to maneuver, make them respect American tanks. For crews, still stuck in 75mm Shermans, the news was bittersweet. They were happy their comrades had better weapons, but they also knew they were still vulnerable. Every crew wanted a 76mm Sherman, but there were only 52 in 2nd Armored Division and hundreds of 75mm models. The distribution of new weapons would take months. The German reaction to the 76mm Shermans was slower to develop. Individual Panzer crews reported encounters with American tanks that had heavier guns. Battalion commanders noted the reports but had no context for understanding them. German tank recognition training didn't include the 76mm Sherman, because German intelligence didn't know it existed. Captured American tank crews were questioned, but most didn't know the specifications of the new gun. They just knew it was bigger and better. Wehrmacht intelligence officers filed reports about improved Sherman variants, but couldn't provide detailed specifications or numbers. How many of these new tanks were in Normandy? Were they a new model or a field modification? What were their capabilities? The answers wouldn't come for weeks. Meanwhile, Operation Cobra was transforming into the breakthrough Bradley had envisioned. By July 27th, organized German resistance in the American sector was collapsing. Entire battalions were surrendering or fleeing south. The Panzer Lehr Division, elite German armor that had fought with distinction since D-Day, was shattered. Only 12 Panzer Mark IVs and 16 Panthers remained operational, along with 30 tanks in various states of disrepair behind the lines. The rest were destroyed, abandoned, or out of fuel. American forces were pushing through the bocage into open country where their mobility advantages could be fully exploited. But the Germans weren't finished. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, commanding Wehrmacht forces in France, ordered, counterattacks. If the Americans couldn't be stopped, perhaps they could be slowed long enough for Germany to establish new defensive lines along the Seine River. Panzer units pulled from the British sector near Caen were rushed west to plug gaps in the line. These included veteran formations with significant numbers of Panthers. The stage was being set for larger confrontations, where the 76mm Sherman would face its ultimate test combat against Panthers in open terrain, where German gunnery skills and superior range could be fully utilized. For Studensky and his crew in Cobra King, the immediate concern was simpler: stay alive. They had survived their first day of combat with the new gun. Many more days lay ahead. The Sherman was still outnumbered, outgunned, and out-armoured by German heavy tanks. The 76mm gun was better than the 75, but it wasn't a miracle weapon. It was a tool. And like any tool, its effectiveness depended entirely on the skill of the men wielding it. American tankers would learn to use that tool with devastating efficiency. But the learning process would be written in blood. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. July 29th, 1944, 1400 hours, near Coutances, France. Oberleutnant Klaus Behrenfänger sat in the commander's position of his Panther Ausführung A, watching American armor advance across open farmland 2 kilometers to the north. His tank, number 424 of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, was positioned behind a stone wall that provided excellent concealment and a perfect field of fire. Behrenfänger had been fighting since 1941, first in Russia, then in France after D-Day. He understood armor warfare as well as anyone in the Wehrmacht. And what he understood right now was that his division was being destroyed, piecemeal by an enemy that seemed to appear everywhere at once. The American breakthrough at Saint-Lô had torn a gap in German defences that couldn't be plugged. Behrenfänger's battalion had been pulled from defensive positions near Caen and rushed west to stop the American advance. They arrived to find chaos. German units were scattered, out of fuel, out of ammunition, or simply gone. The Panzer Lehr division, which had stopped British attacks for weeks, no longer existed as a fighting force. 2nd SS Panzer Division had perhaps 40 operational tanks remaining from the 150 they'd had 6 weeks earlier. The rest were destroyed, broken down, or abandoned for lack of fuel. And now here came more Americans. Behrenfänger counted through his commander's periscope 12 American tanks moving in 2 columns along a dirt road. Sherman medium tanks, the type he'd been destroying since Normandy began. At 2,000 meters range, his Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun could kill every one of them before they could effectively return fire. The mathematics of the engagement favored him completely. But something felt wrong. The Americans were advancing without infantry support, without artillery preparation, almost casually. Either they were inexperienced replacements who didn't know better, or they knew something he didn't. He ordered his gunner, Unteroffizier Werner Schulze, to prepare for engagement. Load armor-piercing. Target the lead American tank, range 2,000 meters. Fire when ready. Schulze's training had been conducted against captured Sherman tanks in Germany. He knew exactly where to aim for a one-shot kill. The Sherman's frontal armor was only 63mm at 56 degrees. The Panther's gun could punch through that like cardboard. Schulze placed the center of his reticle on the lead Sherman's bow and squeezed the trigger. The Panther rocked backward from recoil. The armor-piercing round covered 2 kilometers in less than 3 seconds. It struck the Sherman's frontal hull with a brilliant flash of sparks and bounced off. Behrenfänger stared through his periscope in disbelief. At 2,000 meters, the Panther's gun should have penetrated easily. Schulze fired again, this time aiming for the turret. Another hit, another bounce. What kind of Sherman was this? Had the Americans up-armored their tanks? Before Behrenfänger could process what was happening, the American column scattered. Tanks dispersed in multiple directions, using terrain folds and buildings for cover. They were reacting like experienced crews, not the inexperienced replacements he'd expected. And they were moving fast, faster than he remembered Shermans moving. Then the American tanks started shooting back. At 2,000 meters, Bärenfänger knew Sherman's 75mm guns were no threat to his Panther. But the sound was wrong. The reports were louder, the muzzle flashes larger, and when rounds started hitting near his position, they hit hard. One struck the stone wall in front of his tank, and instead of the small crater a 75mm would create, it demolished an entire section of wall. Bärenfänger suddenly understood. These weren't standard Shermans. The Americans had brought up heavier guns. One of the American tanks, Bärenfänger couldn't tell which because they were all moving, fired a round that struck his Panther's glacis plate. The impact was tremendous, much heavier than any Sherman gun he'd faced before. The armor held, but barely. Penetration craters appeared on the interior surface of the glacis, though the shell didn't break through completely. Bärenfänger's loader screamed. Spalling fragments of armor knocked loose by the impact had torn through his arm. Blood sprayed across the breech mechanism. The loader collapsed, clutching his mangled limb. The rest of the crew was stunned. American guns weren't supposed to be able to do that. Bärenfänger ordered his driver to reverse. Get behind better cover. Reposition before the Americans closed the range. As the Panther backed up, Schulze kept firing. He hit 2 more American tanks at range. One stopped, smoke pouring from the engine deck. The other kept moving. These new Shermans were tougher than the old models. The Americans were learning. The range was closing rapidly. 1,500 meters, 1,200. The Americans were using the terrain expertly, advancing by bounds while providing covering fire. This wasn't the cautious, hesitant American armor he'd fought in June. These crews knew what they were doing. At 800 meters, one of the American tanks got a clear shot at Bärenfänger's Panther from a 45-degree angle. The round struck the side armor just above the track. The Panther's side armor measured only 40 millimeters. The American shell, whatever it was, punched through like tissue paper. The penetrator entered the fighting, compartment traveling at supersonic speed. It struck the main gun's breech, ricocheted downward, and detonated stored ammunition in the hull floor. Bärenfänger had a split second to register what was happening before the entire world became fire and noise. He threw himself out of the commander's hatch as flames erupted from every opening in the tank. His driver and bow gunner never made it out. Schulze clawed his way through the turret hatch, his uniform on fire. The loader was already dead from blood loss. Bärenfänger hit the ground hard and rolled away from the burning Panther. American machine gun fire kicked up dirt around him. He crawled into a drainage ditch and lay there, watching his tank burn. After 3 years of combat, after surviving Russia and France, he'd just been knocked out by a Sherman. The impossible had happened. The comfortable superiority German tankers had enjoyed for months was gone. The Americans had closed the gap. Not completely the new American gun. Still couldn't penetrate Panther frontal armor reliably, but close enough that tactical skill now mattered more than technical specifications. And if there was one thing American tankers had, it was determination and numbers. For every Panther Germany fielded, America could field 10 Shermans. If even 2 of those 10 could now fight back effectively, the mathematics of attrition had shifted decisively. The American tanks rolled past his position, their commanders standing in the turrets and scanning for targets. Bärenfänger got a good look at them as they passed. The turrets were larger than standard Shermans, with longer gun tubes. He estimated 76 or possibly even 88 millimeters. Definitely not the 75mm guns he'd grown accustomed to. How many of these new tanks did the Americans have? If this was a limited deployment of specialized variants, German tankers could adapt, but if the Americans were fielding these in large numbers, the entire tactical situation in Normandy would change. German tank crews would have to be far more cautious, far more tactical. The days of sitting hull down at extreme range and destroying Shermans with impunity were ending. Wehrmacht intelligence eventually identified the new American tank as the M4A 176W. Reports from the front described encounters with American Shermans mounting heavier guns. Captured crew members confirmed that a new variant had arrived in theatre in late July. German recognition training was hastily updated. New silhouette charts were distributed, showing the larger 23 turret and longer gun barrel. Panzer crews were warned that not all American tanks were easy kills anymore. Some could fight back. Some were dangerous. The psychological impact on German tank crews was profound. For weeks, they had enjoyed technical superiority. A well-positioned Panther could destroy multiple Shermans before being threatened. That confidence was now eroding. Every engagement required caution. Every American tank might be one of the new 76mm variants. German crews couldn't afford to be complacent. The comfortable assumption that American industry was inferior to German engineering, an assumption reinforced by Nazi propaganda, was being challenged by reality. If Americans could field heavy guns on their medium tanks, what else were they developing? The Tiger II was Germany's answer to Soviet heavy tanks, but how long before Americans fielded something comparable? More immediately, the 76mm Sherman changed tactical calculations. German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to engaging from extreme range now had to account for American guns that could hurt them at medium range. The Panther's advantage in armor and range was still real, but it was no longer overwhelming. A Panther at 1,500 meters could still kill Shermans with relative impunity. But, at 800 meters, a 76mm Sherman could penetrate Panther side armor or turret armor. The engagement envelope had narrowed. German tactics had to adapt. Field Marshal von Kluge received intelligence reports about the new American tanks with grim resignation. The broader strategic picture was clear. Germany was losing the war of industrial production. American factories were producing tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Now those tanks were getting better, while German production was declining under Allied bombing. The Panther was an excellent tank, possibly the best medium tank in the world, but Germany couldn't produce Panthers fast enough to replace losses. American factories were churning out thousands of Shermans and continuously improving them. The 76mm gun was just the latest improvement. How long before Americans developed better armor? Better engines? More powerful guns? The trajectory was clear, and it didn't favor Germany. For German soldiers on the ground, these strategic considerations were abstract. What mattered was survival. Panther crews adjusted their tactics. They engaged from longer ranges when possible. They chose defensive positions more carefully. They avoided situations where American tanks could close to medium range. Some crews began requesting transfers out of armor entirely, preferring the odds as infantry to being trapped in a burning tank. The psychological dominance German armor had enjoyed was breaking down, and with it, German morale. August 7th, 1944, 0 to 300 hours, near Mortagne, France. The German counter-offensive, codenamed Operation Lüttich, was hours old. Hitler himself had ordered the attack, demanding that German forces drive west to Avranches, cut off American forces that had broken through at Saint-Lô, and restore the Normandy front. 8 Panzer divisions, nearly all of Germany's remaining armor in France, were committed to the offensive. Among them were some of the most elite units in the Wehrmacht, including 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. These divisions included significant numbers of Panthers and Tigers, Germany's most powerful tanks. If any German force could stop the American advance, it was this one. Staff Sergeant Robert Lupe of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion sat in his Metenne tank destroyer, watching the road from Mortagne through night vision binoculars. His unit had been rushed into defensive positions east of the town to block the expected German attack. They were told to expect heavy armor. Intelligence estimated perhaps 200 German tanks were moving toward their sector. Lupe's M10 mounted a 3-inch gun that was marginally effective against Panthers from the front. He and his crew knew they were in for a difficult fight, but they weren't alone. Dug in alongside them were several M4A 176W Shermans from the 2nd Armoured Division, rushed to Mortagne to reinforce the defence. The German attack began before dawn. Lupe first heard them before he saw them, the distinctive sound of Maybach engines, dozens of them, approaching from the east. Then shapes began appearing in the pre-dawn darkness. Panthers and Panzer Mark IVs, advancing in column formation along the road. The German plan was simple: punch through American defenses before they could organize, then race to the coast. Speed and shock were essential, but the Germans didn't know American forces were ready and waiting. Luppi's battalion commander gave the order to hold fire until the German armor reached optimal range. Let them get close. Let them think the road was clear, then hit them with everything. At 600 meters, American guns opened fire simultaneously. Tank destroyers, 76mm Shermans, anti-tank guns, all targeting the lead German vehicles. The column's lead Panther exploded, its turret blown 20 meters into the air by an ammunition detonation. The second Panther lurched sideways as a track was destroyed, blocking the road. The third Panther tried to reverse and was hit by multiple shells simultaneously. Within 60 seconds, the first 5 vehicles in the German column were burning wrecks. The rest of the column ground to a halt, trapped between American guns and the destroyed tanks blocking the road ahead. German crews reacted with professional skill. Panthers and Panzer Mark IVs dispersed off the road, seeking cover and firing positions. Return fire was immediate and accurate. Luppe's Maten was hit twice within a minute, though both rounds struck the gun shield and deflected. The crew scrambled out and took cover in a nearby building. All around the defensive perimeter, similar scenes played out. German armor trying to maneuver while American guns poured fire into them from prepared positions. The Americans had every advantage except armor thickness. They had surprise, prepared positions, knowledge of the terrain, and now, crucially, guns that could threaten German tanks. The 76mm Shermans proved their worth that morning. Captain James Burt, commanding a company of M4A1 tanks, positioned his Shermans on high ground overlooking the main German avenue of approach. When Panthers tried to maneuver around the destroyed column, they exposed their side armor to Burt's tanks. The 76mm guns fired in rapid succession. Armor-piercing rounds punched through Panther side armor at ranges from 400 to 800 meters. 5 Panthers were destroyed in less than 10 minutes. The German attack in that sector stalled completely. Elsewhere along the defensive line, German forces made limited progress. A battalion of Panthers broke through American lines north of Mortain, pushing nearly 3 kilometers before being stopped by concentrated artillery fire and air attacks. But the main thrust toward Avranches was comprehensively defeated. By mid-morning, German forces were in retreat, leaving behind dozens of destroyed tanks and thousands of casualties. Operation Lüttich had failed catastrophically. Instead of cutting off American forces, the German counterattack had exposed their remaining armor to devastating losses. Panzer divisions that had been Germany's mobile reserve in France were now shattered formations barely capable of defensive operations. The Battle of Mortain was significant for several reasons. Tactically, it demonstrated that American forces could defeat German armor in defensive battles even when significantly outnumbered. Strategically, it marked the end of German offensive capability in France. After Mortain, German forces in Normandy could only retreat, trying to avoid encirclement. But for the story of the 76mm Sherman, Mortain proved something crucial. When properly employed in coordinated defensive operations, the 76mm gun could kill Panthers, consistently. American tank commanders learned to position their 76mm Shermans where they could engage German armor from flanking positions. The gun's limitations against frontal armor became less important when tactical positioning could force Germans to expose their sides. German after-action reports from Mortain painted a grim picture. Multiple Panzer commanders reported being surprised by American tank firepower. Panthers that should have been immune to Sherman guns were being penetrated and destroyed. The reports sparked urgent questions at Wehrmacht High Command. How many of these new American tanks were in theatre? Were they a new model or an upgraded variant? Most importantly, what were their specifications? German intelligence worked to answer these questions, but the fog of war made accurate assessment difficult. Some reports estimated dozens of heavy American tanks, others suggested hundreds. The truth that approximately 276 Millimeter Shermans were in Normandy by early August, was somewhere in between, but the psychological impact far exceeded the actual numbers. For American tank crews, Mortain was a turning point in morale and confidence. After weeks of feeling outgunned and vulnerable, they had stood their ground against Germany's best armor and won decisively. The 76mm gun wasn't perfect. It still couldn't reliably penetrate Panther frontal glacis armor. It still lacked the high explosive performance of the 75mm. But it worked. It gave American tankers a fighting chance. And in the context of American advantages in numbers, logistics, air support, and artillery, a fighting chance was enough. By August 15, 1944, German forces in Normandy were trapped in the Falaise Pocket, a shrinking encirclement south of Caen. American forces advancing from the south and British-Canadian forces pushing from the north had nearly closed the pocket, trapping approximately 100,000 German soldiers and the remnants of multiple Panzer divisions. The destruction of German armor in the Falaise Pocket was comprehensive. Panthers, Tigers, Panzer Mark IVs, hundreds of German tanks were destroyed or abandoned as their crews fled east on foot. Some were destroyed by Allied air attacks. Many simply ran out of fuel and were abandoned. Others were destroyed in desperate fighting as German units tried to break out of the encirclement. The 76mm Shermans participated in the fighting around Falaise, though their role was limited by the terrain and the chaotic nature of the battle. Most German tanks were destroyed by air attacks, artillery, or tank destroyers rather than in tank versus tank duels. But the presence of 76mm Shermans forced German tank commanders to be more cautious even in retreat. Every American tank might be one that could hurt them. That caution slowed German movements and contributed to the effectiveness of the Allied encirclement. When the Falaise Pocket was finally closed on August 21st, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army effectively ceased to exist as organized fighting forces. Perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 Germans escaped the pocket, but they left behind nearly all their heavy equipment. Photographs from after the battle show roads choked with destroyed vehicles. Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks, trucks, artillery pieces all abandoned or destroyed in the desperate attempt to escape. The Wehrmacht's position in France was broken beyond repair. Paris would be liberated on August 25th. By September, Allied forces would be at Germany's borders. The 76mm Sherman continued serving throughout the campaign in northwest Europe. As production ramped up, more units received the improved tanks. By January 1945, 76mm Shermans made up approximately 25% of American tank strength in Europe. That percentage would continue growing as the war progressed. The gun proved effective against all German medium tanks and could threaten even Tigers and King Tigers under the right circumstances. Combined with improved armor on later Sherman variants and the introduction of HVAP tungsten core ammunition in limited quantities, the 76mm Sherman evolved into a genuinely capable tank destroyer. But the gun's limitations were never fully overcome. The Panther's frontal glacis remained largely immune to 76mm fire, except at point-blank range. American tankers continued to rely on maneuver, coordination, and numerical superiority to defeat German heavy armor. The ultimate solution to the Panther problem, the M26 Pershing, with its 90mm gun, didn't arrive in meaningful numbers until March 1945, far too late to affect most of the war. The 76mm Sherman was never the perfect answer to German heavy armor. It was simply the best answer available, and American tankers made it work through skill, courage, and determination. Staff Sergeant Eugene Studensky survived the war. Cobra King, his M4A 176W Sherman, fought through France, Belgium, and into Germany. The tank was hit multiple times, but never penetrated. Studensky credited the 76mm gun with saving his crew's lives on at least 4 occasions when they engaged German armor that would have destroyed a 75mm Sherman. After the war, he returned to his family's farm in Wisconsin. He rarely spoke about his experiences, a common characteristic among combat veterans. The memories were too intense, too painful, But in a letter to his former gunner written in 1968, Studensky reflected on what the 76mm gun had meant to them. "It wasn't perfect," he wrote, "but it was better than what we had. And sometimes, better is enough." Lieutenant Klaus Behrenfänger also survived, though his war ended at Mortain, where his Panther was destroyed. He was captured by American forces while trying to reach German lines on foot. He spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in England, where he was interrogated extensively about German tank capabilities and tactics. His interrogators were particularly interested in his experiences fighting the new American tanks. Behrenfänger told them honestly, "The 76mm Shermans were a significant improvement over the 75mm models, capable of threatening Panthers under many combat conditions." But he also noted that the Panther remained superior in a frontal engagement at range. American advantages, he explained, came from coordination, numbers, and tactical flexibility rather than pure technical specifications. After the war, Behrenfänger returned to Germany and worked as an engineer in the automotive industry. In a 1973 interview for a German military history journal, he reflected on the Normandy campaign and the evolution of American armor. "We convinced ourselves that American tanks were inferior," he said. "That was a comfortable lie. The Sherman wasn't as heavily armored or as powerfully armed as the Panther. But it was reliable, it was produced in enormous numbers, and the Americans kept improving it. By August 1944, they had closed the gap enough that our technical advantages no longer guaranteed victory. We lost because they adapted faster than we did." The story of the 76mm Sherman is ultimately a story about industrial adaptation and the pragmatic American approach to warfare. The gun wasn't developed to be the best anti-tank weapon in the world. It was developed to be good enough, available in large numbers, and compatible with existing tank production. American military doctrine prioritized reliability and availability over technical perfection. This approach frustrated American tankers who wanted weapons equal to German heavy armor. But in the context of total war, the approach worked. Germany produced approximately 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. America produced over 49,000 Shermans of all variants. Even if individual Panthers were superior to individual Shermans, and they were America's quantitative advantage was overwhelming. The introduction of the 76mm gun in July 1944 represented a crucial moment in that production strategy. American industry demonstrated it could not only produce tanks in vast quantities, but also improve them rapidly in response to battlefield needs. The 76mm gun went from concept to combat deployment in less than 2 years, despite bureaucratic obstacles and doctrinal resistance. Once deployed, it was continuously improved with better ammunition, muzzle brakes, and integration into improved Sherman variants. This cycle of rapid improvement and deployment characterized American industrial warfare. Germany produced technically superior individual weapons, but couldn't match American production volume or adaptation speed. For German tank crews, the appearance of 76mm Shermans marked the beginning of the end of their tactical superiority. The comfortable dominance they had enjoyed eroded throughout late summer and fall of 1944. By December, during the Battle of the Bulge, German Panzer crews faced not only 76mm Shermans in large numbers, but also the first M26 Pershing tanks with 90mm guns. The technical gap was closing rapidly. Combined with Germany's deteriorating logistical situation, declining fuel supplies, and lack of trained replacement crews, the erosion of technical advantages proved catastrophic. German armour that had terrorized Allied forces in June 1944 was reduced to scattered, immobile defensive strongpoints by April 1945. The human cost of the delay in deploying the 76mm gun remains incalculable. How many American tank crews died in 75mm Shermans during June and early July 1944 who might have survived with better guns? Thousands, certainly. The bureaucratic resistance to the 76mm gun before D-Day, based on logistics concerns and doctrine rather than battlefield necessity, cost American lives. General McNair's death at Mortain during the same operation that validated the 76mm gun carries its own bitter irony. His policies delaying heavy tank and gun development contributed directly to the vulnerability of the Sherman crews who died under his command. But once the decision was made to deploy the 76mm gun, American logistics demonstrated remarkable efficiency. From General Bradley's order on July 12th to combat deployment on July 25th was 13 days. In that time, over 100 tanks were moved from storage depots in England, loaded onto ships, transported across the English Channel, distributed to combat units, and employed in the largest American offensive since D-Day. This achievement showcased American logistical capabilities that Germany simply couldn't match. German tank crews in Normandy were often immobilized by lack of fuel, despite being only a few hundred kilometers from German supply depots. American tank crews received new vehicles from across the Atlantic in less than 2 weeks. That disparity in logistical capability ultimately determined the war's outcome more than any technical specifications. The legacy of the 76mm Sherman extended well beyond World War II. The gun and its mounting system were used in American tanks through the Korean War. Modified versions armed Israeli tanks through the 1960s and 70s. The basic design principle, mounting the most powerful gun possible in a reliable, producible tank platform, influenced American tank design for decades. The M48 and M60 tanks of the Cold War era represented direct evolution of Sherman design philosophy. Balance firepower, armor, and reliability within a platform that could be produced in large numbers and maintained by average crews. For the veterans who fought in 76mm Shermans, the memory of that summer in 1944 remained vivid decades later. The relief of finally having a gun that could fight back. The continued fear of German heavy armor. The bitter knowledge that better weapons had been available but withheld. The satisfaction of proving that American tankers, given adequate equipment, could match any enemy. These memories shaped how veterans understood their service and their sacrifice. They had fought in machines that weren't as good as the enemy's. They had won anyway through courage, coordination, and the support of overwhelming American industrial might. That victory was real, but it came at a terrible price paid in the lives of crews who never received the improved weapons they needed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.